Good morning. Welcome to Beyond the Ballot, how election officials are facing 2024, the launch of the National Association of Election Officials, commonly known as the Election Centers, renewed standards of conduct for election and registration officials. A special thank you to Square One. We have with us today Priscilla Kirsten and Cindy Canary, whose support for this effort has been invaluable. My name is Tammy Patrick, and I'm the CEO of Operations for the Election Center. Our organization is a small but mighty team, including Mindy Moretti, the editor-in-chief of Election Line, who's here with us today. How many of you start your day with Election Line? Excellent. How many of you are not sure what I'm talking about? It's okay. Election Line is your daily resource for news about elections and election administration. If you are a reporter, or a media person, or an election geek of any form, you want to start your day with Election Line. It's free, and you should go there as soon as we're all done with our programming. The National Association of Election Officials has more than 1,700 members in 46 states, a few of the territories, and here in DC. And we're the only association for state and local election officials, as well as election professionals in the vendor and nonprofit fields. Presidential election years are a very busy time for our members, as well as those of you representing the Fourth Estate, and we appreciate you all spending time with us here this morning. We often talk about the patchwork of our decentralized election system, about all the idiosyncrasies and the variation in election administration from one state to the next, one jurisdiction to another. But for all of those differences, there are in fact commonly held core beliefs shared by those who have made this profession their life's work. I attended my first Election Center event 20 years ago as an official from Maricopa County, Arizona, and I was thrilled to meet election administrators from all over the country, to learn about how they served their voters, to gain insight on more effective and efficient ways to improve this great experiment and the work to fulfill the promise of all that we can be as a nation. One thing that I took back with me, in addition to all those great ideas, was a 6x9 card of the Code of Ethics and Principles of Election Officials. A tangible artifact of the binding shared beliefs, it hung on the wall of my office where I could look at it every day and be reminded that this profession is a calling, that there are thousands of dedicated Americans working every day to ensure that their communities are able to make their voices heard at the ballot box, to remind me of that oath that I took when I first started the job. This gave me the strength when the long hours took their toll, when challenging phone calls wore me down, when facilities decided right before an election that they no longer wanted to be a polling place, or when election officials, poll workers quit by the dozens and sometimes even by the hundreds. This touchstone with my colleagues gave me strength, it gave me faith, it reminded me of why so many do this job, because we know it isn't for the wealth and fame. Today we'll hear from others the importance of a unifying mission and standards of conduct in our profession, as well as the challenges that they are facing in this moment, and those challenges are many. Gone are the days when election officials would lament that we toiled away in obscurity. Remember those days? Seems so long ago. Today's speakers will share how they're rising to this moment, drawing upon the commitment of the field to free and fair, secure, and accessible elections for all eligible voters. They will demonstrate what it means to embody in word and action the standards of conduct. Make no mistake, they will be tested. We will all be tested. At a recent event that we had here in DC, we heard from former Secretary of Defense and Senator Chuck Hagel about the importance of this election. To be clear, for the last few election cycles, we've heard that this is the most important election of our time. But Secretary Hagel agreed that we are at a critical juncture in our history, and this year will be studied by future generations. What remains to be seen is what role each of us will play and how our actions and our words will be remembered. So we have a great program in store for you this morning. I don't want to spend too much time with my remarks because we've got some great content. We have election professionals. We have some of the brightest minds in the field to share their perspectives on where we're at and where we're going. So I'm going to begin the program and turn it over the podium to my dear friend Steve Moreno, who's a member of the Election Center's Board of Directors. And thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Tammy, and good morning to everybody. And thank you for those that are here in person and for those that are watching live stream. And thank you for joining us today. The Board of Directors of the Election Center, as the National Association of Election Officials, is so excited to make this initiative public today. We are proud of the work election officials have been doing around the country. This good work is supported by the strong public service values and commitment to the highest standard of ethics. 25 years ago, the Election Center worked with members to develop the code of ethics for members that we refer to as our standard of conduct. And I'd be remiss if I don't mention a couple of folks that helped with this. Our first executive director, Mr. Doug Lewis, who many of you know and still stay in contact with. And I'd also be remiss if I didn't mention Dr. Robert Monjoy, former professor from Auburn faculty. We also have a board member currently on our board, Tom Wilkie, that helped with this project many years ago. These standards were then adopted by the state and local officials around the country. And to this day, members agree to uphold these standards each year. We have also incorporated these standards into our national certification program for the field known as CERA, which is the Certified Election Administration and Voter Registrars and Vendor. When members graduate from CERA program, they take on the oath that includes fidelity to these standards. We maintain our commitment to these standards and to lifting up the profession and supporting election officials. We are especially proud that we are able to do this work under the umbrella and Institute for Election Administration Research and Practice in lifting up the shared work of election officials and researchers and the partnership with Auburn faculty who work with us in that effort. This is not our first project under the banner of the Institute, but it is by far the most public and has led to great member involvement, as we should expect in membership organization that represents election officials and other stakeholders across the country. This is what a practitioner and research partnership looks like. On behalf of the Board of Directors, it is my honor and pleasure to be here today with all of you and share the wonderful work of this committee with the broader public. Now I have the honor of introducing another board member and also a professor from Auburn University, Mitchell Brown.
Thank you, Steve, and good morning to everybody. My name is Mitchell Brown. I'm the Curtis O. Lyles III Professor of Politics at Auburn University. I am here to introduce this project before I turn it over to Hillary Rudy. The project is an effort and part of an effort of the Institute for Election Administration Research and Practice, which is a collaborative effort of the Election Center and Auburn University under the leadership of Dr. Kathleen Hale, and through which we serve as the curricular faculty for the CERA program and support for election officials through applied research projects. This kind of research complements the work of the Election Center and their national certification program by combining principles of professionalization, public administration expertise, and election history, law, and practice. Got a couple slides for you. I don't have a couple slides for you. Those are Hillary's. All right. That's totally fine. Then I'll pivot. So during the 2020 election cycle, election officials asked us how to talk to the public in a way that the public could hear and understand that the work that election officials were doing every day around the country was underscored and conducted by integrity and accuracy, and in compliance with both the laws of the nation and the states that election officials worked in. In response to this, we pulled together a research advisory committee of election officials from around the country, and through that research advisory committee, we collected and reviewed the messages that election officials themselves were using to talk to the public about the integrity of the election effort. We then spent the next 2 years following up this effort by running national focus groups and some national survey experiments to determine which of these messages seemed to work best. I was going to, if you'd seen the screen, call out Commissioner Tom Hicks. One of the messages that tested the best was one that he sent out during the 2020 election cycle, and he then agreed to allow us to use his image in some of those national survey experiments, and he was quite the hit. So, but it's not up here, that's fine. So through this effort, we were also engaged at the time and having conversations about how to lift up the Election Center's standards of conduct as a way to achieve the same goal. For the past 35 years, as Steve Moreno mentioned, the Election Center has had as an integral part of the CIRA certification program a focus on ethics and ethics training. One of the 12 courses in the CIRA certification program is on ethics. Election officials spend 10 hours going through a variety of standards and processes and working through a variety of scenarios that pose ethical difficulties. One election official referred to these once to me as the Kobayashi Maru of elections. For those of you who don't get that, we can talk later. So then through the generous support of the Square One Foundation, we were able then to lift up the Election Center's work on ethics and combine it with the previous work we'd been doing on election officials' messaging to the public. We engaged with partners from around the country to flesh out the standards of conduct and annotate that. You will see the names of the people in the back of the toolkit that you have who helped with this effort. We then engaged in a multi-year project to field listening sessions and focus groups with election officials and other stakeholders in the community, as well as to run surveys to really understand what the values that election officials were bringing to the work, how that corresponded with the standards of conduct, and to better understand what the biggest issues that election officials faced and how they were facing them. This led to the development of a cross-partisan committee of election officials from among the Election Center members who were then put together under the leadership of Hillary Rudy from the state of Colorado to work on those standards of conduct and the annotation of them and to really create a vision for the future of the work in the field. Moving forward, we will continue to reinforce and lift up the remarkable work that election officials are doing around the country by continuing to strengthen our ethics training through both the CIRA program and through public-facing online modules around ethical issues for all election officials, through public-facing messages, as well as through building a movement of election officials who publicly assert and will work together to lift up their collective efforts. So with that, I want to turn this over to Hillary Rudy, who will talk you through the annotated code and the toolkit that you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mitchell. Good morning, everyone. I am honored to chair the Committee on Ethics and Practice. As Mitchell noted, it is a cross-partisan committee representative of the membership of the National Association as a whole. The committee members include Natalie Adona from Nevada County, California, Zoe Birch from Charleston County, South Carolina, Barb Byram from Ingham County, Michigan, Mark Coakley from Henrico County, Virginia, Bruce Elfont from Travis County, Texas, Monica Holman Evans from the DC Board of Elections, Ricky Hatch from Weber County, Utah, Maria Panglianen from Guam, the Board of Elections in Guam, Jennifer Scutchfield from the Kentucky Secretary of State's Office, and Wesley Wilcox from Marion County, Florida. Our committee represents the broad diversity and rich experience of our entire National Association. We began meeting last August to begin discussing the annotated code and to begin finalizing that for this effort. And through the course of several meetings, we engaged in a lot of thoughtful discussions around the importance of shared ethical standards and how those provide practical context with the work that we're doing. Over the course of those discussions, it was incredibly important to us as a committee that the application of these principles be nonpartisan and reflect the nonpartisan of election administration in our jurisdictions, and that they be applicable to jurisdictions across the country, regardless of size, resources, regardless of the diversity of their experience. As you heard, election officials have been following the Code of Ethics for decades. These aren't new principles, but our goal was to provide context, to help provide a broader understanding around what these principles mean to election administrators as we do our daily duties, and what they mean to us when we face complex ethical questions and how they inform our decisions around those questions. Our discussion of the principles and their practical application was informed by case studies, our experiences, those of our colleagues, and they led our discussions around what these principles mean to us in practice. I want to discuss the principles in the annotated code. There are 10 of them, so in the interest of time, I'm going to focus on just 2. So the first is, I strive to maintain the highest level of knowledge and expertise in the elections process through continuing education and self-evaluation. And in thinking about what those mean to us in principle, these are in your book if this is a little small on the screen, what we discussed is that it's very important to us as election administrators that we seek out opportunities for professional development, that we take advantage of opportunities to share best practices and cross-pollinate best practices across jurisdictions. Sharing of best practices comes in many forms and practices, but state associations have a strong role to play there in terms of providing a forum for those best practice sharing, and in many cases, providing an avenue for that professional continuing education. It's also important that we set our staffs up for success by hiring based on skill and putting people in roles that make sense based on their education, expertise, and skill sets, and providing continuing education opportunities for our staff so that they too can learn those best practices and continue to grow in their roles and continue to innovate and create new ideas. And being open to improvement. One of the most important factors of continuing education and continuing to grow as an election official is being willing to self-reflect and think about areas where we can improve, finding ways to be more efficient. Election administration is often challenged by strict resources, less resources than we need most days. And one of the best ways that election officials rise to that challenge is to innovate and find creative ways to meet those challenges. The next I want to discuss is I am resourceful and responsive to changing conditions within the framework of the law and carrying out my duties on behalf of the public's interest. I mentioned that election administration is complex and challenged with limited resources, and creativity and flexibility is one of the ways that election officials across the country rise to that challenge every day. Elections are also complex in that they change. The laws change, the rules change, there are continuous changes to the process. And being open to new ideas, to new innovations, to being willing to adjust your processes based on a last-minute change is important to the field. We need to be able to adjust our approach to meet voter needs in the face of changing laws, rules, processes. We need to collaborate. Sharing those best practices at those state association meetings, at the meetings of the National Association, is critical to our success as election administrators. The processes that we learn from each other are durable, and they are the best processes to meet the challenging needs. Evaluating for efficiency, and again, being creative in how we address those needs is also critical. And then being willing to embrace new technology. Over the nearly 2 decades that I've been in election administration, I've seen a wholesale change in elections technology. And we need to be able to be prepared for whatever that next set of technology is. And again, that continuing education, the training, and being able to meet with each other and share those ideas and best practices is our best avenue for being prepared to innovate and being prepared to meet our voters' needs where they are. The entire annotated code is in the toolkit. There are 10 principles. I encourage you to read each of them. These are 2 that resonate with me on a day-to-day basis, but honestly, from the first principle to the 10th, they are critical to how we conduct our daily work. As Tammy shared, she posted a copy in her office. I have one in mine, and many of our staff in the state of Colorado do as well. This code is a resource for election administrators to use in communicating with the public about the principles and what it means to be ethical and how you're navigating complex ethical challenges when they arise. The toolkit includes resources, including media recommendations, messaging and talking points, sample social media posts, and templates that you can use in communicating with your community. Our committee is currently working on additional tools to help support election officials, including a new field-specific framework to support ethical decision-making in uncertain circumstances, and considering topics for additional ethical trainings. We're considering what might guide those online trainings and what resources might be useful in future trainings. These new resources and initiatives will give election officials an expanded set of tools to build trust within their communities and increase public knowledge of their work. As a Sarah graduate, I've taken an oath to uphold the standards, and I wholeheartedly believe in them. I hope all election administrators will join me in using the standards and the resources in the toolkit to communicate with the public about our principles and what it means to conduct elections with transparency, honesty, and integrity. Please reach out to the team if you have any questions or requests for support, or reach to Clyde about other opportunities to engage publicly. These practical tools are intended to help local election officials around the country. Conversations about ethics in election practice exist within a broader context. And I'm now going to turn the stage over to Ben Ginsberg to talk about a related effort that he and his colleagues have spearheaded. We are delighted with the synergy between their effort and the Election Center's 30 years of leadership in this area. Ben is the Volcker Distinguished Visiting Fellow at the Hoover Institution and is a nationally known political law advocate. His clients have included political parties, campaigns, candidates. It's a long list. He's also represented 4 of the last 6 Republican presidential nominees, and I am delighted to introduce him.
Well, good morning, and many thanks for having me here. It's a happy confluence of events for us to appear here with the Election Center to celebrate and laud this important effort that you've undertaken in producing the standards of conduct for election and registration officials. Congratulations, Tammy Patrick, Kathleen Hale, Mitchell Brown, Steve Marino, Hillary Rudy, for this project that will resound to the benefit of all members of the Election Center and the many fine election professionals you serve and train. I'm pleased to be here to discuss the American Law Institute's Ethical Standards for Election Administration, an effort which neatly dovetails with what you're doing at the Election Center. I'm here on behalf of my co-chair, Bob Bauer, and the project's research director, Professor Charles Stewart from MIT. Charles, of course, is both the sage and the muse of all things election administration, and we truly enjoyed working with him to prepare this report. Bob and I are quick to say that Charles was really the one who performed the Herculean task of gathering this information, talking to the professionals who aided us, and producing this document. And while Bob and I are longtime political adversaries, the 3 of us worked together, along with many of you, on the Presidential Commission on Election Administration in 2013 and 2014. And that experience gave Bob and me 2 political hacks, a real education and appreciation for election professionals and the work that you all do in terms of making our elections actually come together. It also gave us an appreciation for the pressures all of you come under really for just doing your jobs. And so that was a real motivating factor in us wanting to take on this particular project. To further our goal of enhancing election administration as a profession through the articulation of ethical standards, we turned to the American Law Institute and its president, David Levy, who were tremendously supportive of this project and who are indispensable in the development and production of this work. Bob, Charles, and I are immensely appreciative to all the dedicated professionals who contributed their expertise as election administrators in preparing this effort. We benefited tremendously from their contributions. Their thoughts and words are reflected in every page of our report, which can be found on the American Law Institute website, ali.org. Throughout the process, the drafting committee of election officials received feedback and guidance from a bipartisan advisory group composed of government officials, election experts, lawyers, and scholars with broad experience and knowledge in the field. That the Election Center Standards of Conduct and ALI's Ethical Standards for Election Administration both come at this time is not a surprise, nor is it an accident. They're parallel, they're complementary, and they're born of the same set of facts and the imperative to convey that election administration is a critical profession to the health of our system of government. That these two entities were working on the same problem at the same time shows just how much the issue is in the air, and that two different organizations with different roles responded in complementary ways. The ALI approach is academic and aimed at providing a legal and moral framework for entities such as state legislatures and state associations of election officials that would like to tackle the topic. It assures them that there is a common way to approach the problem and documents that a lot of work still needs to be done. Both the Election Center and ALI projects show that part and parcel of being a profession is the need for shared, clearly articulated standards of both ethics and conduct that can help election officials do their jobs, train those who assist them, and set public expectations for performance and transparency. Trust in the institution of elections and the men and women who conduct them has recently been called into question as never before. Despite the utter failure to produce evidence to back up the charges that our election systems do not produce accurate results, just the leveling of those unsubstantiated charges has cast unprecedented scrutiny onto election officials and the essential role they perform in the peaceful transfer of power that's the foundation of our country. ALI, an organization of lawyers dedicated to the rule of law, and the Election Center, an organization of election professionals, share a similar goal in our parallel projects. Both recognize that the focus on election officials and their actions has become more intense in the last decade. I think all of you know that. The need to reassure the public that their actions are fair, professional, transparent, and ethical has only grown. While much of the work of this community of administrators is prescribed by law, a significant portion of what they do to prepare for and conduct elections depends on sound professional judgment and their integrity. Ethical standards play a vital role. State and local laws provide some guidance for state and local, through state and local codes. Election officials, like other public servants, take oaths of office, and those who belong to professions, like the law, have additional ethical requirements. However, as election officials gain both significant public visibility and scrutiny, this is the time for identifying the ethical standards unique for this profession, wherever it is practiced, in order to show the public that awareness of adhering to universally accepted ethical practices has only grown. In other words, a uniform code for election officials to provide guidance in the administration of voting systems throughout the country. The result of these ethical standards for election administration that recognizes election officials as a distinctive professional class. We see articulation of these ethical principles as a way for election officials to take the offensive as they defend themselves against inaccurate attacks on the process. Election officials have hard-earned experience that is applied to making elections secure, accessible, accurate, and fair. And while they are certainly public servants, they are also professionals whose actions are rooted in deep moral values. These moral values are your personal values. They arise from state and federal constitutions and the laws that are enacted in a constitutional setting. Much of the need for uniform ethical and conduct standards in the election profession stems from what Tammy mentioned before, the country's fierce commitment to federalism through the creation of 10,000 local jurisdictions that run our elections. While election officials do adhere to a variety of ethical principles and codes and conducts, there is no unified set of ethical standards or principles to which all jurisdictions can turn and to which the public can refer when assessing the specialized and unique work of election administrators. As the report's executive summary explains, assembling ethical guidelines for all jurisdictions at the state, county, and local levels offers many advantages. It provides a shared vocabulary to communicate the moral basis for election conduct to voters, aids in training new officials by reinforcing the broader purpose of election administration as a profession, and also helps internalize values to guide officials when facing internal pressures. The ALI ethical standard sets out 7 principles. They're not just aspirational, but we believe practical. They explain to voters how election officials understand and will carry out their responsibilities to the electorate. And they help to develop the standards of conduct needed to put these principles into practical effect. They also guide officials in meeting the extraordinary challenges in the polarized politics of our time. We hope you'll turn to ALI.org and take a look at the full detail of what we have. One of the realities that we address as we've prepared this report is the ethics of transparency is particularly important to election officials, since often they themselves are candidates affiliated with political parties or owe appointments to elected officials. The ethical standards stress that the connection between politics and election administration puts a premium on clarity and transparency. Clarity of laws so that election officials and the public know what is required of them, and transparency in execution so that the public can judge for themselves that officials have acted appropriately. I spoke of the nation's commitment to federalism and local control of elections. Reflective of that, the ALI working group found that some states had ethical standards in place and others did not. But many of the election officials consulted endorsed a document like these standards to help guide the behavior of election officials when the law is ambiguous and especially when officials are feeling pressured to favor one outcome over another. The working group concluded that having a set of ethical principles that all use the same language and require the same moral compass would help assure voters that our elections themselves are conducted fairly, and that this shared language would help election officials explain all the portions of the election process to the public. With that, we really appreciate and congratulate election officials for the difficult job that you do. Around the country, election officials are carrying on day in and day out the core work of our democracy, the recognition of election officials' work as the work of professionals guided by robust conceptions of public service and clearly articulated ethical commitments, we believe can provide additional reassurance to the voting public as we head into the 2024 elections. Thank you. I'm told we have time for a few questions, if anybody has questions on our report or sort of the state of play generally. And I think we can probably all answer them if there are any questions. And if not, that's even better. Thank you all very much.
Hello. Thank you very much to the Election Center and the National Press Club for having us today. My name is Madeline May. I'm an investigative producer for CBS, and I cover threats to democracy, extremism, and political violence. So I have the pleasure today of leading this panel with our local election workers and to hear from them what they are anticipating for this upcoming election. Local election workers are the front line of our democratic process. They're often the first to spot complications, receive threats, and engage with their community. Here with me is Mark Coakley, the General Registrar of Henrico County, Virginia. Mark has worked in elections since 1996 and started his time in North Carolina. Also with us is Monica Holman Evans, the Executive Director for Board of Elections here in DC. She has worked in elections for 11 years. So I'd like to start today by asking each of you what brought you into elections and what has kept you in this work.
We said we were going to do this and defer to one another. Good morning. Quite honestly, I have always been kind of an elections nerd. I love the industry. One thing I can say is, you know, people have different levels of education, economic status, but the one thing that is true, despite mis and disinformation, everybody gets one vote. And I love being part of a franchise, and I love being part of this, what I call a fraternity sorority of election officials, because I feel like we're like-minded individuals who are committed to ensuring the integrity and fairness of elections, and I think we do it well. And just being part of such an important endeavor in this country, it makes it worthwhile, even when it gets a little hard and you feel beat up on days.
I started off in '96 as an intern in Greensboro, North Carolina for the presidential primary at that time. And my first phone call was, I missed my ride to the polls, can you come pick me up? And as an intern, I thought I could do that because I got coffee and water for the staff and everything like that, but I was told no. But it got me to thinking that we are servants to the public, and we need to do our best to make sure that the public and the voters know their process and know the rights that they have. And I think that's what got me and it makes me continue so many years later being servants of the public for elections and for voter registration.
Yeah, and you know, public perceptions of election workers have certainly changed in the last few years. There's a lot more public attention on you and the work that you're doing. What else do you anticipate being some of the biggest challenges to local election workers for this next election cycle?
I think, well, I trended on Twitter a few years ago where our election official pay was not as great as it should be. People think they're volunteers, and they are volunteers, for the hours they spend, the training that they go to, the night classes, the after-election work. It's a season, not a day. So working with the election officials, make them feel appreciative, knowing that there are professionals behind them that stand ready to help them and guide them through the day of the election and the season that it takes.
And threats that I'm seeing, particularly with this 2024 election cycle, we're dealing with cyber threats. We're dealing with physical threats to election workers and our offices. And you know, even with AI, there's mis and disinformation. These are things that we have to deal with in addition to executing a successful election. I think that just getting people to understand some of those things. And of course, the tried and true challenge to all election jurisdictions, of course, is being properly resourced. We're always asked to do more, but that more does not always come with additional funding.
Are there any lessons learned from the last election season that you're taking with you into 2024?
I'll start. I know that even though resources are limited, you can find ways to make things work. You have partners outside local governments that we represent to go to. You need to have a good relationship with at least on our county, with all other departments, the libraries, the rec and parks, general services, and use their resources. IT apparently, has gone to the desert and gotten money for us that we didn't know existed, and we use these other partners in local government to help out us for resources and the election process.
And I think one of the lessons learned is the fact that you need to try to be proactive. One of the hard parts of elections is you don't know what you don't know, and you don't know what you're going to face in any particular election cycle. But now that we're seeing an uptick with threats and even racially charged messages delivered to our offices, we're being proactive. We're not going to wait until something happens. We're putting things into place now. And even transparency, I think that's a big piece, just letting people know what we're doing. We're posting more information on our website. We are making sure that we are providing answers to questions oftentimes before those questions are asked. And finally, communication. We have implemented a number of different methods of communicating with voters in the District of Columbia, and also making sure we're addressing the digital divide. We have to remember that people do not get their information in the same way. Social media is fabulous. It's a way to reach large numbers of people in short periods of time, but we also have to think about our seniors and individuals who do not utilize social media or have access to those digital means.
Yeah, it seems like within both your questions, there's the issue of community, right? How do you build a community in your local government, or how do you build a community that's receptive to a new communication strategy? What does it look like to build trust in a community? I know that trust is a big theme of today.
Sure. I would go to page 10 of your manual. I dignify voters by promoting equal opportunity to participate in the democratic process. And I think that's real important, that we're there for everyone, that we are not inclusive. We have opened up our General Assembly in Virginia is in session now. There's 134 election bills on the floor at this time. And laws change every year. We pivot, we rotate, but we're always there for the core process of democracy and what that means.
Yes, and for our office is really letting people know that we are accessible. People can come visit. We invite people to come. Our logic and accuracy testing, our counting and tabulation of ballots, those are public processes, and people can come and observe those. Also, I make myself accessible. People have my direct email. People have my direct phone number. They do not have to go through someone to reach me. And so I entertain questions. I often get, hey, I know you're the director. You may not be the best person. If you can get me in touch with a staff person, I will always provide that first response. I'm not just going to pawn someone off. And letting people know that we value opinions. And when we have new legislation passed in the district, we reach out to our partners, we get feedback, and we engage them, and we post things for comment on our website so that we are not operating in a vacuum. And I think that's very important for us to convey to our constituents.
So the last question I have for both of you before we open it up for questions is, what advice do you have for other local election workers heading into the future?
I would say the biggest piece of advice is don't reinvent the wheel if you don't have to. I mentioned this fraternity, sorority of election officials in different jurisdictions we have. some of the legislation that has recently passed in the District of Columbia. Other jurisdictions have had similar legislation for years, and so reach out to your colleagues. Sometimes it's just reaching out for support. It's not that they can necessarily provide a solution, but I say that when you sit in the seat of an election official, you are in a unique position, and people don't really understand unless they have sat in that seat. And so reach out to your colleagues, ask for material, share. We commonly do that, but just knowing you're not alone as we face a very challenging election cycle, I think that that's the biggest kind of takeaway and advice that I would have.
Sure, and a great colleague of mine said, cut and paste, learn from others. You don't reinvent the wheel. You take the best practices. An election center is great by having a best practice approach. Right now, we're looking into the ethics and an ethics hotline type of thing going on in the near future. But anytime that you can learn from your colleagues and take the knowledge that they have and just be a sponge for that, and that's what I would say is just be the sponge for elections moving forward.
Great. I actually had one other question, hearing you talk. But what is the most common, when people are reaching out to you, reaching out to your offices, what's the most common issue or complaint or concern that they're raising?
Sure. I will say after the last presidential, can I see my ballot? And we say, no, you cannot see your ballot. We have a secret ballot, and we're proud of that fact. But just informing the public, being the face of your county, the face of the county seal or the state seal, and just reassuring them that, we are here for you and we want to do what's best for democracy and for your vote.
That's an interesting question. One thing I would say that a lot of the inquiries we get are around information they've seen elsewhere, and they're trying to confirm. And so part of our messaging is helping people realize that we are the trusted source in the District of Columbia. We appreciate other entities and websites trying to amplify the information, but sometimes they get it a little wrong. And then we've had a lot of new legislation pass in DC. And so things that were in effect 10 years ago look very different today. And so I think it's just conveying that, when you have questions, reach out to us, because there is some unintentional misinformation out there just because of the numerous changes we've had lately.
Excellent. Well, I'd like to open it up to audience questions if anyone has a question for our panelists. I think we have microphones in the back that will be passed out. But if you have a question, just raise your hand and they'll bring a mic over.
Dr. Myrtle Alexander, Myrtle for Congress is my organization. So I have a question regarding the individuals, the voters, that have lost hope in the election process. How can we provide the information that we need and to give them the confidence back that the election process is as democratic as it used to be and will be for this upcoming election?
Sure. So I will say in the community, I was a JC, I was a president of my Rotary Club, I'm in the finance committee of church. I try to get out to the community of Henrico as best I can through homeowner associations, and just in trying just to be a citizen. I'm a taxpayer, I'm a registered voter, independent in Virginia, and just by being out there, going to the grocery store, things like that, just being able to be stopped and just saying, hey, I'm here for you. How can I help you? What questions do you have? And getting stopped at church is pretty amazing. How many people want to say, hey, I know you. How can I? And I'll say, let me help you out with this situation. So that's how I would handle it.
And just generally, I would say communication, communication, communication. We have a very robust education and outreach division. They have engaged in up to 50 events in a single month. We make an effort to hit every type of entity, every type of organization, and partnerships. And we just try to stay on message, let people come in, observe our processes, let people know that, you know, your vote does make a difference. And then we try to start young. We have efforts where we go into high schools in the District of Columbia. In DC, you can pre-register to vote at the age of 16. And sometimes when you're beginning that messaging young, it helps people to grow up with that messaging and with confidence in the electoral process. Even with individuals who are not in high school and not eligible to pre-register, we invite elementary school kids in our offices. They get to vote on real voting equipment. We explain the voting process. We explain why it's safe, all the safeguards we have in place. And when you hear those messages from us time and time again, and we try to reinforce those messages, we're hoping that we are planting seeds that will grow in future generations, and it will restore the confidence and trust in the electoral process.
Thank you. The First Circuit Court has just ruled that the state of Maine is out of compliance with the National Voter Registrations Act, that voter records have to be made public. However, states and districts that are a member of the ERIC contract, the Electronic Registration Information Center, the nonprofit, by their laws or by the contract have to keep those records private. So could the panelists help us make sense of how the federal court just again ruled and affirmed that the NVRA, under NVRA, voter records are a public document, and yet if you're a member of ERIC, you have to keep those somewhat private? Thank you.
You know, that's a great question, and in our next panel are secretaries of states. I would like to defer to the secretaries of states for to keep that question in mind, but I do know that in Virginia, you know, we follow the constitutional and federal laws, but we have state laws too, and it's just that balance of power that you have to have, you know, and we defer again to the state office of elections in Virginia to handle those situations.
Yeah, and we do understand that there appears to be somewhat a disconnect in what we are required to provide. I am not going to say a whole lot on the issue because I'm currently the recipient of a lawsuit. We're hoping that that will be settled soon, but I don't want to say too much on the public record about that.
Hi, I'm Chris Till with Route 50. I had a question about DC. I don't know if you're the only jurisdiction that has to worry about Congress kind of overseeing and maybe playing politics with your elections as well. How do you navigate that when elected officials try and, you know, say things about DC laws that maybe are incorrect because they're trying to make kind of political hay out of that?
Thank you for that question. How do I navigate that? I try to navigate it with grace. That's the general response. It's very challenging when we conduct elections that are fair, we conduct elections that are with integrity, and we conduct elections according to the laws that are in effect in the District of Columbia. I think it's really disappointing when we are the only jurisdiction where it has been deemed that we are not capable of administering our own elections. We're not capable of making decisions based on the will of the residents in the District of Columbia. We try to educate, we try to let people know that we are performing the same election functions as any other jurisdiction in this country. We talk about the safeguards we have in place. We have invited individuals to come and review our processes. To date, nobody has taken us up on that. But, you know, at the end of the day, I have a job. And so I am determined to perform my job to the best of my ability. It's hard when you kind of get the arrows and the, you know, darts and, you know, you kind of feel as though you're a target. But that does not in any way deter me from our core mission. And we just hope that people will help us amplify the fact that we are like any other elections jurisdiction. We have the same goals, and we hope to be treated with the same respect and collaborative effort that other elections jurisdictions enjoy. So we'll see what's to come.
And if I could just add, with DC, the District of Columbia, and the 50 states, I think we have in territories, we have over, 5,000 jurisdictions, and that's just amazing. 5,000 different ideas of we live in the best one, or we could be up to their par. And, where's my voter guide? Well, we're a state that doesn't issue voter guides, but, so having to, tell your citizens and your voters that we're one of 5,000, we're one of 51 plus territories, and the education part of it, I think is just really key and important to all citizens and voters.
Yeah, hi. Thank you. It's Gary Fields here from AP. You've mentioned a couple of times things like threats. So how do you actually recruit people in this high threat environment? How do you keep them secure? What kind of protections do you have to do these days? Because I think we've all actually seen like cases like in Georgia where the threats are real and they are impacting people's lives. So how are you dealing with that?
So at 2 o'clock, I'm on a call for my emergency management services. We do tabletop exercises where we use other departments, again, general services, IT, a Commonwealth attorney, and we get together and we come up with a train rail derailment of toxic waste happens, by your warehouse. How do you get voting machines out? Security threats at a polling place. So we prepare. We have COOT plans. We come up with the scenarios, and we use other agencies and resources to handle it. And then and we just assure that the voters and our workers, the officers of election, we're there for you, and we can help you the best that we can. There are resources out there to help and secure and have a safe election.
What he said. And of course, we work with our local and federal partners. We work with Metropolitan Police Department. We have relationships with CISA, Homeland Security. We are constantly getting intel regarding potential threats to elections, election workers, and things that they're seeing. They will immediately reach out to us. I mentioned, being proactive, and that's one of the things that's critically important. We have to try to anticipate some of the things we may see just based on the landscape. During the latter part of 2023, we saw some issues with substances being mailed to election offices. We did not experience that in DC, but we had to put protocols in place in the event we do see those things happening. So when we are alerted to any type of activity, we always try to put something in place so that we're able to address what's going on. But we don't do it alone, and we're very appreciative of our local and federal partners to assist with intel and also putting measures in place so that individuals are safe. As far as the recruitment piece, I have to admit that we have not seen huge drops in the number of people who are interested in being election workers, but that tells me how important they believe our work is. And they are committed and they show up, which is wonderful. Similarly, I have to be committed to keep them safe. And so we are looking at vote centers, we're looking at our operations center, we're looking at our headquarters, and we are already thinking about things that we will adjust in 2024 to provide those additional levels of safety and security.
Hi, Tom Hicks with the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. I want to thank you both for being here, and thank you, Ms. Evans, for participating in our election summit last week. My question revolves around living in a multi-jurisdictional area with media markets, and how do you get the correct information out to your voters when it could be different in the Virginia area, DC area, or Maryland area? Thank you.
Yes, and that is, an issue we face, just being in the DMV, and you have people who work in DC, live in Virginia, and spend a lot of their time in Maryland, and making sure they are getting the correct messaging when it comes to elections for their registration address. And so there are challenges, but we also work very collaboratively. And even with voter registration, we have had instances where all 3 jurisdictions partner together to provide voter registration, so we're able to have those conversations and education with, and we can send some people to the other table. It's like, nope, you're Virginia, you're Maryland, and those partnerships are important. Again, I just can't emphasize communication. I know it's difficult because, television ads from Virginia run in DC, television ads from Maryland run in Virginia. It's just, the nature of our jurisdiction. So we are required to be extremely diligent, and we try to reach DC residents specifically with personal touches. We have yard signs we place in the district. We have door hangers. We have voter guides. And we try to ensure that we're reaching not just DC voters, but all DC residents, and have those personal touches, because we know that digital communication does very easily cross the boundaries, within the DMV.
Sure. In the DMV, you have same voting hours, right, in all 3 jurisdictions? No. So, going with media that outside the Metro Richmond area that I live in, with Chesterfield and Hanover and Henrico and the city, it is constant communication with media partners, with your social media, with any mailings you can do that hit. I know, your utility bills, even the Val packs that we've used, anything that you can do to reach out and let them know that this is how it is in your community. And that's what we tell them. It's your community. This is how to reach us and get out the vote.
Mark and Monica, thanks again for doing this. I'm David Levine with the German Marshall Fund. My question for you is, I think we've danced around and talked about it, but I'm just interested in getting your thoughts a little more directly, due in part perhaps to the pressures and the threats, right? The exodus of election officials, the retention of them. As a former official myself, right? Mistakes, as much as we try to sort of reduce them, right? They still happen from time to time. I mean, I think that even in 2020, for example, there were jurisdictions that had made mistakes as they were having to make quick transformations and adjustments in response to the pandemic. I think one of the issues I think you guys and others have sort of thought about is, how do we make sure that, when mistakes are made, right, they're not sort of blown up to sort of cast out on the election more broadly? I'm interested in tips you both have for that, right? Being able to sort of concede and admit to those and talk about them, but to try and contain them and provide confidence sort of at the same time.
I mean, own up to them. That's what I always say. We do make mistakes. We're humans, but we learn from them, right? And you try not to make the same mistake twice. A voter in Virginia gets a Democratic primary ballot, but asked for a Republican one. The default in the software starts at Democratic, and then you had to click a link to go to Republican. It wasn't nefarious. We weren't doing it on purpose, but our lowly part-time employees clicked the wrong button, and we owned up to it. We apologized. We sent them the correct ballot, and we know now what to do in the future. So again, I think that's the best thing is not trying to hide anything from anybody. Just take the ownership of it and move on and improve the process.
Absolutely. You really have to own the mistakes. I always say nobody's perfect, and what is the best way to course correct when something goes awry? And I always say own it, learn from it, and don't try to hide it. when you're, just honest about what happened and you have measures in place to address it. If you got the wrong ballot, we can get you the right ballot. There was no intent behind that act. But in elections, I often feel like we're held to a different standard. Other industries can make mistakes and they receive, grace. In elections, not so much. But, realizing that and knowing that that is the case, we just still make every effort to say, we've learned from it. These are the measures we put in place so that it won't happen again. And let's, move forward.
So I have a follow-up question regarding the ballots, because in DC we have both residents and citizens that can vote, the residents in local elections and citizens in federal elections. So the question is, are there two different ballots? And as you mentioned, receiving the wrong ballot, is it up to the officials or the individuals to identify the wrong ballot?
Yes, and this is actually the first election cycle where that will be an issue. And so we're still developing some of those policies and procedures. And so we are looking at two distinct ballots so that they are easily identifiable. And instead of combining residents and citizens in the same database, we do have a separate database to try to minimize any mistakes or issues with getting and the incorrect ballot. But again, messaging is going to be key. We'll make efforts to place things on our website, brochures, so that people can be certain that they received the correct ballot and what to do if you did not, and just making sure our election workers are properly trained on the differences that are coming with this 2024 election cycle. So in some ways, we're still building that plane, but I am confident that it will run smoothly. So we have great people, great staff at Board of Elections, and we've been very thoughtful about how we need to roll this out to ensure that people are getting the proper ballot and voting in the proper contests.
And are you well prepared for the individual that they meet the criteria? Do they know if they meet the criteria? How is that being proposed?
Education. Yes, very robust education campaign. That was one of the things we did receive funding for when that legislation was passed. And so we have received an additional staff person, and we just had a conversation with our communication specialist yesterday, and we talked through some of the things we need to roll out, and we'll really begin that process in earnest later this month, beginning of March.
So we have time for one more question for Mark or Monica. Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Mark and Monica, for your time, and they'll be around for other questions later. Thank you.
Hey folks, my name is Zach Montalero. I am the politics and democracy reporter for Politico, so hopefully the second thing you read after Election Line. I am happy today to be joined by two of our nation's Secretary of States, chief election officials in their respective states. Both on my left, but all the way down, is Secretary Michael Adams, the Kentucky Secretary of State, first elected in 2019 and recently won re-election last year. Before that, he was an election lawyer and a litigator at organizations including the RGA. Closer to me, Secretary of State Adrian Fontes, elected first in 2022 out in Arizona. Before that, county recorder at Maricopa County, one of our nation's largest counties, and also a lawyer before that. And I guess still currently lawyers, not gone yet. what's going to happen in 2024? We'll start broad before we get to beyond the ballot. But as we know, a big election coming up this year. One of two of your states, at least, will be among the most intently focused on. What are you guys thinking about, not on the political side of it, but on the election administration side going into 2024? And I guess Secretary Fontes, we'll start with you because I'm closer to you.
Well, thank you, Zach, and fellow Secretary, good to see you again. And it's nice to be with you here this morning. What we're expecting for 2024 is a continuation, I think, of this long, slow-rolling civics lesson that the United States of America has been thankfully engaged in over the last several years. We've learned a lot about the rule of law. We've learned a lot about the role of local government in election administration. And I think a lot of what has happened is really a lot of light has been shed on how important our election administrators, like the two members of our prior panel, at that particular level are. Having been there myself and in the eye of the storm, as you mentioned, back in 2020 and before, we really have learned a lot. And I think now is the time where we're going to see those folks not only stepping up, but a lot more folks paying attention to the real work that gets done. The real work that gets done not just by the elected and appointed folks at the top of the election administration pyramid, whether it's at the state level or local level, but the folks in the polling places, the folks who are actually driving the trucks and moving stuff around in the warehouses and assisting voters. To me, that's where 2024 is going to be focused. Some of what's going to happen there is what we see every single cycle, the occasional human error. And unfortunately now, bad actors with bad intent are going to blow these things out of proportion and pretend like the sky is falling just because somebody moved a box from point A to point B, and the person making the accusation doesn't understand that that's actually a standard procedure. The other thing that's going to happen, I hope, is that a lot of folks, like folks in the media here, are going to look beyond the hyperbole and the hype and cover the reality of election administration. That it is hard work, it's detailed work, it's work that folks prepare for years in advance and are trained for and have, ethical standards for and are doing well and have done very, very well for a long, long time in this country. So will this year live up to the hype? I think that depends on how the national storytelling is framed. And that falls to a lot of folks in this room. Are we going to focus on sort of the naysayers and the folks who are out there hoping for a carnival, or are we going to focus on the people that have integrity, that are following the standards in the law, and are just really making it happen so that we can preserve and protect our democracy?
So a couple thoughts. Trying to predict the future. I was elected in 2019, and I'll never forget my first NAS conference, National Association of Secretaries of State, was in January, the month I was sworn in. And our focus was cyber. Our focus was not letting the Russians hack in, and basically it was fighting the last war from 2016. And then, of course, 2020 actually happened. And the threats in 2020 weren't the same threats. They were totally different. And that's just the nature of anything is learning from the past, but also understanding that's of limited value in helping you anticipate the future. So there's some good news and some bad news. Here's the good news. People like my colleague and me, I just got reelected. All of us that are in these positions now know what we signed up for. I was elected in 2019. I didn't know what I was signing up for in 2020. And neither did the county clerks in my state that ran in 2018. They were not expecting 2020 or what we've seen since. We had a lot of attrition in my state, several states, but certainly in my state in 2018, a lot of turnover with county officials. All those people, though, know what they're signing up for. All of our poll workers know what they're signing up for. God bless them. So I think everybody who has put themselves forward at every level of our election process, they're going into this knowledgeably and emotionally prepared for what they're going to potentially receive. So that's good news. The biggest challenge I see is actually not the stuff that is the most interesting and controversial. It's the workaday problems that we had even when I first ran in 2019. So I'll give you an example. In 2019, I was elected, and I was asked to speak to my state legislature about my plans. And I said, the biggest crisis that we have coming in our elections is inadequate poll workers. This is before COVID, and that's still true. It's getting harder and harder to get people to volunteer. It's also harder and harder to get locations. More and more people are signing off, whether it's volunteering their property to be a voting location or whether it's volunteering of their own time to be a poll worker. And it's not just because of the crazy, it's a lot of things. It's an aging workforce, if you will. And those are challenges that we have. Those are evergreen. Those don't really go away. And one more piece of, I guess, bad news is in 2020, I was flush with money. I had CARES Act money, I had HAVA money, I had state money, I had all kinds of money to throw at potential problems. I don't now. I also have more power than I have now in the sense of I had emergency powers to deal with emergencies. Those got repealed. So I don't have the ability to go in and fix individual problems that I had 4 years ago, and a lot of Secretary of States have seen that on their fronts as well.
You, Secretary, you talked about fighting the last war, and I think 16 we relitigated 20. God willing, we won't be relitigating a pandemic in 2024. But what is the war, to use that metaphor, that you think we're going to be fighting this year? Is it this focused on AI? Is it the routine, like poll workers? Is it something else? Is it threats to election workers, which we've talked a lot about since 2020? What do you think that war, quote unquote, in 2024 is going to be?
Well, if I could tell you, I certainly would. But I will tell you this, the evergreen challenges never go away. And I think it's risky for people like me to focus on the interesting things at the neglect of the basic blocking and tackling of getting poll workers, getting locations. Let me give you an example on the locations. There are more challenges there this time than last time in a couple of ways. One is kind of localized to my state, but maybe some other states see this too. Abortion's a hot topic. And in my state in 2022, we had an amendment to change our state constitution with respect to abortion. Very, very close contest. And some of our voting locations are places of worship. And they took, in some cases, differing sides on that issue. And so voters on one side got ticked off at the church that they had stuff for the other side, signs or what have you. And so the churches got fed up and they quit. I know several states have had, Kansas, Ohio, others have had abortion amendments on the ballot. We in my administration, I don't have 4,000 buildings around the state that I control that I can make voting locations. I'm relying on the private sector. I'm relying on community centers, churches, schools, and more those places don't want to be voting locations. Schools, for example, we worked really hard to get the schools to work with us. The schools don't really want the general public on their premises. Go to visit your kid's school today, it's under lockdown. And schools don't really want people just coming on who aren't onto the campus who aren't parents. They're worried about some potential active shooters scoping the place out. So it's getting harder and harder to persuade locations to volunteer. We've also seen the Biden administration step up ADA enforcement, and in some instances, we have old locations that aren't ADA designed, and so there's some litigation over whether those should be grandfathered or not, but that's just kind of one more thing that makes it difficult.
Anything you're thinking of?
Well, I wouldn't classify it as a war because that implies us versus them, and I'm too much of a Pollyanna to think that of the American public. Several past comments notwithstanding. I think I have to agree with the secretary here. It's kind of the same old stuff. It's just a different package. Let's talk about generative artificial intelligence, for example. Everybody's freaked out about AI. Generative artificial intelligence is an amplifier to the same messages that we've already heard, the same doubt casting, the same conspiracy theories, the same nonsense. It's going to amplify it a heck of a lot faster and a heck of a lot more effectively than we've ever seen. And the real challenge is going to be for truth tellers, sort of those neutral storytellers, members of the media, to be able to keep up with what is real and what is not real. And it's going to be particularly challenging for those of us in the election administration world who are actually running the elections to try to keep up as well. And so I guess if there was a conflict, it is truly what democracy is about. It is as between those of us who want everyone to vote, and winners be winners and losers be losers, and let's move on and do it again in a couple years, and those who don't want us voting. Those folks who want this entire experiment in democracy to crumble. And we see that attack against all of our institutions. I am a recipient of a lot of the support against that in my own election in 2022, for which I'm very grateful. And we've seen time and time again, particularly in 22, when we had so many of our colleagues, running against a lot of sort of the election denier type of folks. But we've seen it in institutions across the board. That doesn't mean it's not going to be there, and it doesn't mean those folks aren't going to try. And I don't want to cast this as, just one group of folks. This is, I think, an effort by a lot of very, very different folks. Foreign actors, very different foreign actors. There are folks certainly who are looking at this for political advantage. There are some folks who are looking at this for financial advantage, who don't care about the politics of the whole thing. They just want to, sort of like the Joker, just watch it all burn down. But it's up to the rest of us to reasonable, rational folks who understand that while this is a complicated exercise, this does require all kinds of preparation, we want to go on with the rest of our lives too. The business of America is business. Let that happen. Higher education needs to bring us knowledge and information and art and beauty and all that stuff. Let that happen. Medicine needs to help us live healthier, happier lives. Let that happen. And hopefully we'll get back to the place where, like everybody in this room kind of interested in this wins, where we don't have to worry about casting aspersions and doubt, where it's not due, and where we're kind of trying to identify problems that don't exist instead of just letting folks do their jobs.
One thing I think part of this conversation is too is how much attention has been shifted to election officials. Certainly both of you ran elections, or in this field at least pre-2020, which feels like an inflection point. Secretary Fontes as a local official, Secretary Adams as a statewide. What does the shift to all this attention on election officials themselves do? I think it'd be unusual for a Secretary of State to be on the cover of Time magazine. One of the three of us has been on there.
It wasn't me.
It wasn't me. Secretaries of State now have kind of an unrivaled platform. How has that changed the job of state officials like yourselves and of local officials, kind of this increased attention both on the office and the individual?
I'll take a crack at this one first. I think it goes back to what I mentioned earlier. It's this civics lesson, right? But wouldn't it be great if some librarians were on the cover of Time magazine, right? Wouldn't it be great if, I know I'm playing a little red meat for the crowd here, if like some newspaper editors from local papers were on the cover of Time magazine, right? These are the institutions of democracy that we've taken so for granted. We have taken them so for granted that all of a sudden, sort of some of the most what we considered mundane and basic jobs, and in reality, they are kind of just regular jobs, folks. There's a lot there. It's kind of new and sexy now, and it's really exciting, and we've got all these codes and stuff. People have been doing these jobs since the inception of the Republic, folks. This is not new work, right? It's under attack. We understand its value, but what if it was the folks who maintained the dams in all of our rivers who were under attack? And all those downriver towns were in jeopardy, and the factories and the farms were in jeopardy. What if it was the folks who maintained all of our bridges that railroads cross specifically? But we'd be paying attention to those folks. That's why this is important, and I think that's where we get a lot of sort of the folks that are still doing it, and as you mentioned, Secretary, the folks that are kind of sticking with it, we get it. A lot of us get it. And there are some folks who really didn't like the pressure, but there's always turnover in industries. But, and it's stark in this one now particularly. We certified 558 election officials in Arizona last year for this coming year. 200, I want to get the number right, 233 of them were new. Jeez, that's a lot. They're first timers. And that's a lot. But again, to repeat your point, these are folks who are coming in eyes wide open. They want to do this. They're motivated to help because they know how important this is. And the fact that we're under attack and so many people from so many institutions across the entirety of our society are coming to appreciate election officials for the work that they do really increases our awareness of the value of the work that they do for our voters, for us, right? Yeah.
I'll just add to that. When I ran in 2019, and I spoke to a group of people, the first question that I got was, what does the Secretary of State do? They had no idea whatsoever. I don't get that question anymore. And I actually think it's a good thing that just even months into my term, and I think this is true of all of us, people know who we are. Every time I go out of my house, people come up to me, sometimes friendly, sometimes not, but people know who we are and they know what we do. And that's overall a good thing. I want people to know who in the government's in charge of what. I think civic literacy is one of our biggest problems. It's contributing to a lot of the stuff that we're dealing with, those externalities. But overall, I think it's a positive thing that people know who the Secretary of State is in their state.
One thing I want to talk about is, and it kind of alluded to in the Election Center's guidelines today, is you're both elected officials. You're both partisans, or you are elected on a partisan line. Secretary Font is Democrat, Secretary Adams a Republican. Not necessarily true for your professional staff, and some local officials are either appointed or nonpartisan. How do you navigate that, being a Democrat, being a Republican? Heck, some of your colleagues are running for governor or running for Senate elsewhere in the country. How do you navigate both being a political official but also having to run apolitical elections? And how do you translate that down the election chain to local officials who don't have the platform that you all have? And Secretary Adams, will start with you.
So I think it's a positive thing that we are elected, and specifically that we're elected by political party. I think that's good for me, especially because I'm a Republican and most of the skeptics are Republicans. And so I feel like I'm in a better position to try to reason with them and explain, hey, you can trust our process. But I also go out of my way to be seen with Democrats, to welcome Democrats in my office, to do joint events with our Democratic governor, to wear purple ties. I do everything I can possibly do to show that I'm not just running the office to benefit my team, that we're being fair and that we're nonpartisan. And one thing that's, I guess, maybe kind of tough for me is all my down ticket officers in my state are all Republicans, and they get the benefit of going out and polarizing every day and attacking the other side, and it looks like a lot of fun, but I don't get to do that. I've got to be the guy that's above that fray and partners with Democrats to show all the electorate that they can trust our system.
Sure. Arizona's a different sort of a place. And I think one of the things that folks don't realize, and that's kind of a little bit shocking, only 29% of the registered voters in Arizona are Democrats. And it wasn't until recently that Republicans held, I think, slightly over a third, and then non-party designated voters took the lead. The Republicans are now back in the lead, top two. I have a feeling by the time we get to November, independents or non-party designated voters in Arizona will be sort of the lead in the plurality there. The way that I deal with it is the way that I've dealt with everything. I was an active duty Marine for 4 years, and integrity was a big, big part of that job. And when we ran 2020, and I ran for re-election in 2020 as the Maricopa County Recorder, and I lost that race very narrowly. I have to make sure that everybody understands that. To Recorder Stephen Richer, who some of you may have heard about. Stephen actually, very interesting, was the guy who wrote the first quote-unquote audit of Maricopa County's elections back in 2018. A very interesting piece. I'd encourage you to look it up and see how much he's developed and grown as a human being. But in 2020, when it became statistically impossible for me to actually catch up in votes, I gave him a call and I congratulated him. And then we took the next step, which I think was one of the most important things that I've ever done. And I invited him to the warehouse, and I asked him to come over for a few hours, and really right close after that. And he came over, and we photographed and videotaped the visit. And I gave him a tour of the warehouse. I gave him a tour of the entire facility. I took him into the recorder's side of the office because we also do recordation of deeds and trusts and all that stuff. And I introduced him to staff, and I said, this is the new boss. This is your guy. And we did a video of this, and we put it out. And when my team showed me the final video, in the last scene, it just kind of faded to black. And I said, no, we have to take the next step. And I insisted that the last slide show up on the street with the seal of the county recorder's office. And underneath it, my name appeared, Maricopa's 29th recorder, and then his name appeared, Maricopa's 30th recorder. And I very publicly and very much pushed it out as much as I could, this peaceful transfer. Not just admitting my political loss, but celebrating the transfer of power in that office. That's one of the main reasons why I ended up getting elected in 2022. And if you remember, right after the election in 2020, not everybody shared that sentiment about losing an election. And so since then, I've garnered a lot of support from a lot of Republicans and a lot of people in the political space because they know that we're going to call balls and strikes. We're going to make sure everybody's votes are counted and everything is just on the up and up, regardless of what my personal opinions are. And being able to separate the two isn't just the adult thing, that's the American thing, right? You indicated jokingly you'd love to be in there kind of pitching some barbs, right? It's the lawyer in you, and the lawyer in me wants to. But so the lawyer in me likes doing that too. I did some criminal work for a while, and I've done plenty of work in front of juries. And the point is this: you act the way you want to be perceived. When you act with integrity and you act with honor. 5 of the 6 pieces of legislation that we have pending right now before the Arizona legislature are sponsored by Republicans because we are acting in a bipartisan manner out of this office on purpose. And that's part of the trust rebuild that we're working on, and that's part of the way that I want to make sure that I comport myself officially, regardless of what we do sort of at our legislative district meetings after hours.
And that transitions to the last question I'll ask before we open up to questions again. If you have questions, just raise your hand, someone will come with the mic. Is that role and how you interact with legislatures in the guidelines, part of it is serving as a source of information for your citizens and voters, certainly, but also for legislatures. Right now, both of your states are dealing with election litigation ahead of 2024. Secretary Fontes, you have the calendar and all that fun stuff going on right now. Secretary Adams, voter ID, and may or may not be taking your recommendations. How do you navigate relationships with legislators who have a lot of thoughts of how elections are run, because that's how they get to office? And then how do you help local officials navigate those same relationships, given that you guys have such a large platform, and in some cases an official role in the legislative process as opposed to an unofficial role like local officials? Secretary Adams, we'll start with you.
So it's getting harder and harder to deal with the legislature in my state. In 2020, I came in and we kind of bonded over having the challenge together of saving the election. And looking back, I'm shocked at how much authority they gave me to be able to address things and change our system really on a dime. We were a state that was 1 day to vote, 12 hours is all you got, very limited absentee, and so 98% of people voted on 1 day and 12 hours. And they had a very short session because of COVID. They aborted their session, and the last thing they did is they gave me and our Democratic governor joint authority to basically reinvent the wheel completely to the extent that we had to. So we had absentee voting, no excuse absentee, to make sure we could avoid lines. We had early voting for the first time, weeks of it actually, and that's how we had a successful election. We were the first state in the country to have a successful election during COVID in our primary. And there were some folks who, on my side, who didn't like what I did, but then the election went really well. And Republicans actually ended up picking up seats, and so they forgave me. But a lot of those people have left. They either got beat or they retired, and they've been replaced by dug-in election skeptics. And I've always had an open door in my office, and I've always invited every single person who's elected, regardless of their party, regardless if I supported their opponent or not, to come in my office at any time, tour the place, talk with us. And I had a lot of D's and a lot of R's take me up on that my first couple of years. We've had a lot of churn in our legislature since then, and people just don't take me up on that anymore. And every single, all but I think 2, of all the election bills that have been filed in my state this session have been filed by people I've literally never met. They just got elected, they ran in many cases on a sort of denial platform, and the last thing they'll ever do is talk to me. They don't want to talk to me. They don't want to be exposed to facts. So that's pretty troubling. That's not the majority. The leadership is still really solid on this stuff, so I'm pretty optimistic that we'll be okay. On the local official front, here's a really important point. I really can't emphasize this enough. 3 years ago, when I was designing my election reform bill, permanent early voting and absentee reform and so forth, we did a lot of polling. And one of the things that we found was that the governor had a lot of support and credibility, and I had a lot of support and credibility, but far and away, county clerks in Kentucky were at 85, 90% approval. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. One is I think people just disproportionately trust local government more than the distant government in the state capital. But part of it is we're a small state with even smaller jurisdictions, 120 counties for just 4.5 million people. The likelihood that somebody knows the county clerk in their county is actually pretty high. They went to high school with them. They go to church with them. They see them at the grocery. These aren't people like me who are, Ivy League and all this kind of stuff, running TV ads. These are people that they live there all day, every day. They're seeing people in their community. They're not distant. They're not different. They wear a T-shirt to work every day. They're just relaxed, normal people. And so people trust them a lot. And so one of the things I've learned is to try to push as much of our messaging down to them as we possibly can. Because people that won't trust a disembodied head on TV talking about the election will trust a local official. There's a lot we can do together. We've really worked hard to try to better connect the federal government and the local governments together to get them security assessments and to also get them proposed messaging. And it's really been helpful to have tabletop exercises among the 3 layers of government as well. But really, I learn a lot from them about the messaging. And of course, we share our talking points with them as well.
Secretary Fontes, you have seen both sides of this, Secretary, and Maricopa Recorder, biggest jurisdiction in the state, certainly bigger than some states as a whole. How do you navigate this?
Well, I try to wear T-shirts to work once in a while, but my chief of staff doesn't approve. You're in an unenviable position because the fight is among your own party, and I think it's a little bit easier sometimes to be on the outside of that and to watch it happen because, frankly, look, we're politicians. You can kind of work that sometimes when it's not in your space. And navigating the state legislature, which has a very, very strong Freedom Caucus, is not that difficult when you make the personal connection. I will call out one of our senators, who's also a veteran of the United States Marine Corps like I am, and he is absolutely among the camp of election deniers. And he's been to my office, and I've been to his office, and we've chatted a bunch of times. We don't always agree, and I have to listen to a lot of stories about, I don't know when he served, but, driving trucks and doing that stuff. And we've actually started building that connectivity that's required. I've sat with one of the House of Representatives folks who's also in the election enthusiast committee, committee, whatever they call themselves. He was one of the lawyers back then in the aftermath of 2020. And we agree to disagree very politely, and we've actually made some headway. And so I think it really is, how do you navigate a legislature that's not really friendly to voters or elections generally? You bust through, and that's the job, right? I've got to do what I can to make sure that the legislature isn't going off on a tangent and doing crazy stuff. And so I've got to do what I have to do to navigate those relationships, and it's not always easy. It's not always easy with my own folks either, right? Arizona's Democratic caucus sometimes disagrees with me on stuff, and that's okay. Again, proof that we can, have the same party moniker on the back of our names, but still disagree. As to the counties, boy, it's a lot easier in Arizona. We've only got 15. You got 120, so. But I do agree they're much more well received by and much more trusted by their local communities. And yes, Maricopa is more like a state government than a county government, so they're kind of an in-between space. But at the end of the day, we're really doing a lot of the same stuff. We're doing the tabletop exercises. We're helping them with their talking points. We're bringing a lot of this expertise from the federal government in to do these inspections. We'll all be presenting later this week we're here for NAS, the Association of Secretaries of State, this week as well, on the cooperation specifically that Arizona has had with CISA, which is the deepest operation that we've had, this Critical Infrastructure Security Agency. And we know everything that the Russians know about our information technology systems, about the counties. And the counties have that information too. So everything from sort of the most mundane walk-a-day, talk-a-day work, the time, place, and manner of elections, all the way down to the very technical stuff about which particular set of software guarding, suites we can employ out there. Those are the ways that we work with the county officials effectively, and they are, of every political stripe as well. We've got some very, very dark red and some very deep blue counties in Arizona, and really at the end of the day, it's just about, I smiled when you talked about block and tackle. It's the fundamentals and the basics, and I think if we're doing that well, including building those personal relationships with members of our legislature, and really being out there and showing those county officials that we're there to support them and their people in those missions. That's really the most effective way to do this work.
Thank you, Secretary. I think we have time for a couple of questions. Just raise your hand, and someone will come with the mic. Yeah.
Thank you. I do have a question for both secretaries, if I may, but I just want to start with Secretary Fontes. When I was in journalism school, I was taught to give voice to the voiceless. Mm-hmm. So, sir, going back to 22, how do you address the voters who showed up on game day and a report, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, some 60% of the machines were malfunctioning, and that they were told to put their ballot in a box, and that the chain of custody on how those ballots were handled got a little fuzzy and a little bit unclear. Did my vote even count? Are they election deniers if they have significant trust issues with how the election will be managed, knowing that there's been controversy in the past 2 cycles in Arizona? Thank you.
Yeah, the election deniers are the folks that are putting that nonsense out there. And the root of your question comes from election denialism. And here's why. It is a standard procedure, and it has been a recognized standard procedure, if the tabulators in a polling place don't count, that there is an alternative place to put those. Those are secured in a particular way with a particular chain of custody, and then they're tabulated back, and they're tabulated back at the headquarters. That's the reality of what happened in 2022. The other underlying reality of what happened was that the tabulators are so sensitive and so secure that an undetectable printing error, and that means the level, the amount of ink that was used on the papers, that error was so tiny you couldn't see it with the human eye, but the tabulators could. It's an anti-counterfeiting measure that we designed into that system. But what happened was it was twisted up into, oh, this isn't working and it's not. Well, that's exactly how it was designed to work. So we didn't have ballots that weren't supposed to be in the system into the system. And so what happened was we had a very secure system where a minor printer malfunction, and really it was the amount of toner, I think it was what ended up happening on the page, wouldn't be read by the tabulators, so they put it in the secure box 3, and then the bipartisan team would close that up, send it back with all of the rest of the stuff to the warehouse to be tabulated by the machines back on there. So the notion that a very secure system can be twisted into doubt, and folks will continue to say, well, there is this doubt, and that's the framing of it, that's the problem that I have. Because it comes from a place where it's as if the folks with the questions want to see something wrong with the system without actually looking at the facts first. So I appreciate the opportunity to set the record straight on that, and I hope that that would waylay any doubt you have, because instead of being proof that the system has issues, this actually should have been the opportunity for us to celebrate the fact that Maricopa County's elections are pretty daggone secure.
There's still litigation, so it's still happening about who was responsible
Well,
for
it doesn't mean
changing
the lawyers
those,
aren't
but
going to want to build ours.
That's
Let's
true.
not
That's
forget.
true. But
right?
a judge should
You can-
kick
yeah,
that out sooner or later.
yeah.
A judge should kick that out. I
Yep.
know others want to probably ask you about the signature problems or the signature issues with the election manual. I'll leave that to others.
I'll have
But
a happy chance
if I
to
may
chat with you
address
later.
Secretary Adams, in Kentucky, and here we go again with a chance to address whether this is election denialism or just good old-fashioned concern about an election system that has shifted massively since 2020 to absentee ballots at a time when there are a lot of questions about how the voter rolls are being maintained. This is how you get to transparency. This is how you get to trust. When you were talking about trust, are the voter rolls accurate, and do I know that my vote's going to be handled, my ballot's going to be handled properly? Secretary Adams, please address the concern, and whether this is true or not, that almost half of some 59 counties in Kentucky are said to have higher than 100%
Who says that?
registration. That would be a nonprofit called Honest Elections Project, as well as Public Interest Legal Foundation. I work with some data geeks. We've run the numbers. We're not putting anything out because we're checking ourselves and we're not in the game of gotcha. But there are some significant questions about some of these counties that have higher than 100% turnout. The question is, voter maintenance, and so could you address that, and whether that is something that should be addressed, especially when you've shifted to absentee? Thank you.
Well, if it's been said, it's not been said to me, and it's not been said to my office. So it's kind of hard for me to comment on people speculating that don't have evidence and don't provide it to me. But I will say that my office, my administration has worked really hard. We inherited a mess. A federal judge found that my predecessor was out of compliance with the National Voter Registration Act, that she hadn't adequately maintained our voter rolls. We have taken 350,000 plus voters off our rolls since I've been Secretary of State, people who had moved away or passed away or had been put away, all three categories. So to put that in perspective, 350,000 people, that's about 10% of our voter rolls overall. We were about 3.5 million voters when we started, so that's a massive undertaking. If there are more that we need to be made aware of and take those folks off within, of course, the boundaries of federal and state law, then we'll certainly do that. But to my knowledge, there's no mass noncompliance at the county level with the law.
And if I could, I want to go back to a question you asked the clerks earlier about Eric and anonymizing or the fact that voter data is not shared. Voter data is shared. The voter rolls are public. And as far as I know, they're public in every state, and you can get those states' data. The ERIC system requires that as we go to share that data to make sure that our state's voter rolls are clear, there's an anonymization process that happens there. That data is not available, and here's why. This Secretary of State, if his state was an ERIC member, would not want me sharing his voter data in any way, shape, or form, because there's no way I could validate it. And so if you want Arizona's voter data, you come to the registrars of voter in Arizona. And it is public record, and you can get all of that stuff. But the ERIC system is designed, and it's quite successful at making sure to achieve accuracy and integrity in our voter rolls. And I would submit as evidence the fact that our report from October showed that among all of the participating states, there was a possibility that there were 270 folks who voted in 2 different jurisdictions, Arizona and one other. Only of the ERIC states, because we can't see what they do in other states. And of those 160, we had enough to refer to the Attorney General's office for potential prosecution or for investigation. You can't do that if you're not an ERIC state. So for folks who want integrity and accuracy in voter rolls, and they want to make sure that folks are following the rules, the best and only way to do that, in my view, is to be a member of ERIC, because that's how that system was designed, that's how it is executed, and I'm very proud that Arizona is still a member of that one. But I was hoping to clear that up from before. So, a question over here? Oh, there's one in the back.
No. Hi, Secretaries. Miles Parks, NPR. Jumping off of one of Zach's questions about partisanship being part of your guys' jobs as statewide election officials, as somebody who's reported on secretaries of state over the last few years, it's become clearer and clearer as these positions have become more high profile, that some people want to use those positions to kind of gain political points. It doesn't seem unreasonable that in 2024, and we saw this a little bit in 2022, unnamed secretary, I remember tweeting about Arizona's elections, kind of implying that there was something wrong. Do you guys expect that in 2024, other statewide election officials will cast doubt on your elections to gain political points? And how do you see navigating that, considering that there's been so much talk about trustworthy information comes from election officials, while at the same time it's become clearer that some statewide election officials may potentially push false election information?
Well, for myself, I don't think that's likely at all. I think the fact that all of us of both parties, not all of us, but almost all of us of both parties meet at least twice a year in person, plus we have other events that we go to like this. We see each other. It kind of humanizes us to each other. We're not like Congress where both sides go to fight the other. We really do work together. We have constant calls with each other, and we socialize and we learn from each other. And so you're always, I think, in any group of 50-ish elected officials, you're going to have some on the fringe of each side that like to shoot at the other, but I think that's maybe 5 out of 50. I think the vast majority of us aren't going to have that situation at all.
Yeah, and as to people commenting on what's happening in Arizona, I mean, you know, go to, you know, Charlie Kirk or Elon Musk for that kind of nonsense. And if that's the kind of person, you know, with that depth of knowledge that some of these public officials who are making comments outside of their scope of understanding, if that's where they want to be, that's where they can be. Right? We're gonna respect the work of our particular jurisdictions and our colleagues, whether we agree or disagree. And the reality is there's so much more that we do that brings us together that even our political divides pull us apart. I mean, well, heck, North Carolina doesn't even, Elaine doesn't even do elections, right? I don't do MVD. I don't know if you do motor vehicles. No, but Colorado does, Jenna does. So we all have a whole bunch of stuff that we do, and we have various committees when we get together, and we talk about a lot of that stuff. And so when I hear of other people outside of the state making comments about stuff, you know, like, you know, you mentioned you start doing early voting, and you were like, God, you know, for the first time, and boy, we even did it for a couple of weeks. And I was in New York City when they started their first early voting 9 days ahead of the election. And I was like, wow, 9 days, right? I mean, it's 27 days in Arizona. And we've been doing no excuse absentee since 1992, I think it is. So a lot of what's happening in other parts of the country is really catching up to what has happened out west, respectfully. Washington has been all ballot by mail for a long time. Colorado went that way. I think Oregon's there. And so, you know, it's hard to put any legitimacy onto criticisms, particularly from way outside, when you know they don't understand what they're talking about, right? Especially like I hear, boy, no, you guys, you got me going on this one. You hear, like somebody says, no more voting machines in Arizona. And I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? We vote on paper. Every ballot in the state of Arizona is a paper ballot and has been for decades, maybe even longer. I mean, we haven't been in the state that long, right? Not centuries anyway. But so we take these criticisms sometimes with the grain of salt that's required, and most of them, when it comes from those sorts of spaces, I just ignore them because they're really not worth a response.
I believe we have time for one brief, and I emphasize brief, question.
Or is it the answer you want brief?
Or no comment.
Yeah, I'm Ned Jones from Henrico County. Nice to see my registrar here. Hi, Mark. Something that's come up, actually a question was asked in the prior panel with respect to the District of Columbia about non-citizens voting. And that seems to be on a lot of people's minds lately. And I know that I haven't read the entire manual from Arizona, but I did read Section 4. And I'm just curious. It seems to be a system that relies on the honor system. When you think about the national form that can be used and UOCABA voters and so forth, not requiring proof of citizenship. So if you could address how your states protect that only citizens are going to vote in our election. Thank you very much.
Well, I'll go first because ours is different than just about every other state in the union. First of all, it is a system based on honor, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. I will stand on that. If you can take an oath, either as an election official, an elected official, or a voter, we should be able to depend on that. And so when we get into a place where we can't trust somebody's word, and as a society that's not enough for us, that's our problem as a whole. So as to the premise that an oath isn't enough, I have a problem with that, because that's really the foundation of this republic requires honorable acts by folks who have been entrusted with certain duties. Now, Arizona has the only, as I understand, the only bifurcated ballot system in the country. We have our regular state ballots and Fed-only ballots, and we've had this for some time based on some litigation from several cycles ago. And if you use the federal form and you don't supply to your county registrar, your county recorder, documented proof of citizenship, DPOC we call it for short, then you can still vote, but you can only vote in the federal elections for President, Senate, and Congress. If you do provide that documented proof of citizenship, then you can vote in the entire ballot. That came out of a Supreme Court case from 2000-something. I don't know. I'm looking around for help, and nobody's giving it. Thanks. And so we've established a system where that is just the way it works. And it speaks volumes to the effectiveness of our recorders, our registrars, and all the people that do this work, that we can keep that system moving, because guess what? This is ballot styles, right? We were talking about that earlier. Yeah, we've got different ballot styles for, I think it was your question, we have different ballot styles for different voters. In fact, Maricopa County, in some of our elections, will have well over 10,000 ballot styles for each election, which is a massive undertaking. But again, can you imagine the professionalism required to proof every single one of those ballot styles? Can you imagine the work that goes into that? And just think about it for a second. You appreciate much more the work that these folks continue to do.
So I'll just add to that. Our office, and I think this is typical for maybe all 50 of our states, our office takes filings on their face. If someone files to run for Secretary of State and they have enough signatures and they swear that they're qualified to run for the office, we accept that. And if someone decides that that's not the case and that person doesn't live in the state or isn't old enough or whatever, then there's a bona fide challenge and that can be litigated. But our office takes those things on their face. We do the same thing with voter registration. We do require a social security number. We do require the person to sign an oath that they're a citizen, because under our state constitution and our state statutes, you must be a citizen to vote in any election in Kentucky. But we don't do background checks. We don't do background checks on people that file for various offices to see if they really do live where they say they do, or if they really are as old as they say that they are, and we don't do background checks on voters either.
Well, I'd like to thank Secretary Adams and Secretary Fontes for joining us. I believe I'm turning the show back over to Tammy to wrap us up. Thanks, everyone.
Wonderful. Well, thank you to all of our speakers this morning. Can we give another round of applause? So I think we've heard some real unifying threads around resources, or lack thereof, I may inject, communication, partnerships, the invaluable resources or invaluable collaborations that can be forged, and also that everything old is new again, I often say sometimes with a twist. So additionally, I believe that we've heard here this morning really reflects the prevailing mindset of the American election professional, and that is a commitment to core values and principles, ethical conduct, the embodiment and embodying the manifestation of the oath that we've all taken to protect our election system and to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. So couple that with proper protocols, policies, procedures, and we can rest assured that our elections do in fact have integrity, that we should have confidence in the results, that the power still rests in the hands of the voters, in we the people. So, here are the takeaways from today's conversation for those who will be watching this recording later on and reading all of your wonderful reporting. Know what your options are. Things have changed potentially based on new laws and maybe even some litigation. Take early action. Check your voter registration. Make sure it's current. Request, if you have to, early your vote by mail ballot. Get it back in time. And then also vote in the days prior to Election Day, again, as applicable and available in your local area. And then also lend a hand. Be a poll worker, offer a ride to the polls. But most importantly, spread the word of what you heard here today. Thank your local election workers. A kind word goes a very long way, especially right now. It's important for people to hear that they are appreciated, that their efforts do not go unnoticed. I'll end with a reprise from the speech I referenced earlier by Secretary Hagel. And in it, he mentioned how proud he was as an American of our elections and our election professionals. So to all of you out there embarking on this difficult journey, taking on this difficult, critical task, bearing this sometimes heavy load, you are not alone. You are courageous. You will do the right thing. I know you will. We see you. We appreciate you, we support you, and we are proud to stand with you. For the press that are here today, thank you for covering this very important topic. I hope you take this opportunity to forge some new relationships with many election officials who are in the room. For those election officials in the room, whether you were on the dais or not, if you would like to speak to some of the members of the press, please stick around for some one-on-one interviews. And today's recording will be made available on the Election Center website, which is going to have a full revamping, yay, very, 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 very soon. So keep an eye out for that later on this spring. And with that, thank you all again for coming today. Have a great afternoon.